Hey everyone, welcome to the Smart Economy Podcast, a production of neonewstoday.com. I'm your host, Dylan Grabowski. In this episode of the Smart Economy Podcast, I sat down and spoke with Nathan Windsor, the co-founder of Landslide. Landslide is a new IBC-enabled Avalanche subnet that enables any CosmWasm-based dApp to run natively on the Avalanche network. In this conversation, we touched upon the OG status that Nathan has in both the Cosmos and Avalanche ecosystems, the differences between both Avalanche and Cosmos at a protocol level, the security that can be levered by building in between and on top of the two, the role and need for permissioned and permissionless blockchain networks, and so much more. Just a reminder, nothing said on this podcast is a solicitation to buy or sell any tokens, and that nothing should be taken as financial advice. Head over to www.neonewstoday.com to see a disclaimer on the tokens that might have been discussed in each episode. With all that said, I really enjoyed chatting with Nathan, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation too. Hey everyone, welcome to the Smart Economy Podcast. Today we're joined by Nathan Windsor, the co-founder of Landslide. How are you doing today, Nathan?
I'm stoked. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to be here, Dylan.
Yeah, I'm really excited. This is going to be a super fun conversation that I had a lot of fun just kind of preparing for, because the two worlds that you're building in are just pretty awesome and have longevity in the broader blockchain space. But before we kind of jump down the rabbit hole of who you are and what you're building and why, I kind of want to get like a higher philosophical question from you. And I want to kick off this conversation by asking you, how does DeFi become more resilient by connecting different blockchain ecosystems?
Great question, sir. Okay, so DeFi becomes more resilient, and people won't like this, but it has to become compliant. And as we're seeing from the US, that is a serious threat to DeFi. So we like to talk about smart contracts, and on the other end of a smart contract violation is sometimes jail. So the community is broad. So there are some people who refuse DeFi, or there are some people who are DeFi maximalists, and then there are some people who are kind of in between. So how do you make it more resilient is, number one, you have to do compliance. That's going to eventually come, and that means KYC, and that means on the other hand, it also means coherent legislation, which the US just has not put forward any to date. And then it also means better validation and more democratic access to validating node services. So we have to comply with the law, and once we're complying with the law, we have to make it open. So you don't want a centralization of nodes, of validator nodes. That's the whole reason that we got into this in the first place, is that you don't want banks bailing things out. You want to have decentralized governance. You want to have decentralized validation. And what we've seen at Landslide, the way that we've put that into practice is IBC, which is the most open source protocol to bridge assets, and Avalanche, which has no hard cap on its validators.
Cool. That's awesome. Thanks for kind of jumping into the deep end with me. So I kind of do want to take like two steps back, because I'm a big fan of folks who have interesting paths and how they've ended up in the blockchain space. For context, I was a former urban planner, and I learned what a 401k was. And then a year later, I was writing about cryptocurrency full time. So I'm curious to hear, how does somebody who graduated with a degree in biology from Cornell end up not even going into that field and kind of doing something completely crazy and different once they graduate by going into the music space? Can you share a little bit about what your initial passion was in biology? And then after you graduated, how you moved into not just being a musician, but also being an entrepreneur in the space as well?
Yeah. So just for anyone listening, I've listened to a bunch of shows that Dylan's done, and this is like one of his big questions that he likes to ask guests. And so I commend you, sir, for like being interested in people's backstories, and because I think it makes this stupid tech world that we're ranting about more relatable and more sort of interesting to people. And it gives people who aren't involved like a way to access, the sort of incomprehensible. So yeah, my background was I went to Cornell. I graduated in 2006 from the biology school. I thought I was, midway through, I kind of like a lot of people on the show, like I kind of like didn't want to do this anymore. So I finished in 3 years and graduated, and then basically moved into music. And so from 2006 to 2020, I lived in New York City. Most of those years I spent in music and music therapy. So I worked in nursing homes, like singing to people in their end stage of life and transitioning into, the great mystery. And, seeing a lot of people pass and helping people in their end of stage life. So I was playing guitar and singing and piano and drum circles and stuff, which is like way out on the other end of the brain. And then like being in New York, like it's sort of the financial center of a lot of the world. And so I got to see like a lot of these emerging and like the Occupy Wall Street movement happened. And then that community of people started talking about crypto as a method of self-sovereign identity or self-sovereign, like own your own finance, own your community economy. I mean, the title of your show is focused around, the economy and like another iteration of economy. And so I happened to be around in Brooklyn when all these weirdos were talking about ETH and like Bitcoin. And so, like I read From Bitcoin to Burning Man, which was this like weird PDF, like written by, like essentially burners connecting what Bitcoin was to how it relates to Burning Man and how these sort of small communities can change ownership of their digital assets. So, and then from there, like I basically joined the communities like in Brooklyn. I went to as many meetups as I could. I bought Bitcoin and ETH in 2015, and then basically became I retrained as a developer in 2012 and helped to build and propose. I tried basically early ETH protocols. I helped fund some early ETH protocols, helped build some, and then our team at Landslide, now we've been together since then. And so now we've sort of, we were early Avalanche investors and validators. And so now we've built essentially like the connection to IBC, because that's sort of the next stage for us, I think, as a Web3 community.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, Occupy Wall Street for me was kind of the genesis for what do I do next? I was out of school at that time and I saw a lot of just frustration. And so actually for me, that's what spurred me to go to graduate school to study urban planning so that we could have a positive impact on cities and the urban infrastructure hundreds of years after we're gone. Yeah. So it's really cool to hear that you had these ties and that Occupy kind of awakened you, especially when it comes to the ability to own your own assets, digital assets in this case. And Occupy taught us that we can't trust the larger traditional financial institutions with as much blind hope as maybe we might have. So unfortunately for the millennial generation, it was getting another Band-Aid ripped off and showing that the world isn't as pretty as it was told to us as we were growing up. But I think that that's really cool. And so you bought ETH, you bought Bitcoin in 2015, and you were a coder for maybe about 3 or 4 years before you bought these first digital assets. One thing I remember, I got into the space in 2017, and I remember around 18 is when the Cosmos SDK was coming out and folks were leaving the ecosystem I was covering on a day-to-day basis, the Neo ecosystem. We had one project leave to build a decentralized exchange in the Cosmos verse. So when did you first come across the Cosmos SDK, the Cosmos ecosystem? Was it around the same time as Avalanche? And what made you decide which one to build in first? I guess might be the best way to phrase it.
So my background is mostly coming from Cornell on this. So the Cornell blockchain group, which is where all of the Avalanche stuff comes out of. Like early on, like in 2016, 2017, around that era, Dr. Searer, like Goon, everyone calls him Goon now, at who co-founded Ava Labs along with Kevin Seknicki and Ted Yin. These guys early on in Cornell, they were like, he was a professor, and they were running a domain called Hacking Distributed. And so, like, as these ICOs, like you mentioned, like there was the Atom ICO and the ETH ICO, and Hacking Distributed, led by Goon and Kevin and some other researchers who would later go on to build MEV stuff, Flashbots, Phil Diane being one of them. These guys were the nerds in the basement that were just like publishing these blog posts that maybe we shouldn't have delegated proof of stake as a validating mechanism because it's like a beauty pageant contest and you could bribe people. And so they would have these opinions about the space that they'd publish as academics that I would read constantly because I was still involved with the Cornell community, and be like, oh, these guys are like geniuses. This is obviously like they're providing math to support it. They're providing logic. And these people, are not shilling something that's like vaporware. So then when Cosmos happened, Jaquan, who was one of the founders, Ethan Buckman and Jaquan was a student of Goon's. And so they learned a lot from, their implementation of Tendermint was influenced a lot by Goon and the work that they were doing at Cornell. It's sort of like Obi-Wan training the other Jedis. It's sort of, it's like there's a lot of overlap there. And so, yeah, just as a weird sort of side patch on this, Tendermint Consensus is the consensus that's used in Cosmos. It's used all over the Cosmos stack. And Tendermint Consensus is deterministic. And Avalanche Consensus is probabilistic. And what that means, like Mr. Rogers' version of this, is like determinism is just like it's always, it's basically it's like 100% that something deterministically, and probabilistically is like, well, it's probably like you're taking 99.999% sure. And so those certainty trade-offs have downstream effects. And one further thing I'll say about that, because we'll get into Tendermint versus Avalanche Consensus, is that all of these chains that we see, ETH, Bitcoin, all these are about consensus, right? It's all about achieving consensus about what just happened. So like, did this team score a goal? Did this person send money? And so like all of this politics around, and the regulation and the theft, all of this stuff that we see like come out of this as a conversation is only related to our ability as sapiens to agree on what just happened. That's it. Like, that's the thing. What just happened? Was it real? And can we verify it? That's the game.
So that is kind of mind blowing to me. I didn't realize that there was such a regional tie to Cosmos and its founders with Jay, as well as Cornell and Avalanche. It's such a interesting kind of regional phenomena that you were quite poised to see the best and the worst of both worlds to kind of build in and bridge them together. So I'm really looking forward to digging in more. I appreciated that you were just talking about the consensus mechanisms, and for maybe the listener who's not aware, I just want to kind of ask you two more Eli 5 high-level questions about both of the different networks, so that as we're talking about them and using phrases and concepts and words that maybe the listener who's first hearing about both these ecosystems for the first time can kind of keep up. So can you just really high-level elevator pitch, share what Avalanche is, and maybe talk a little bit about the subnets? And then also talk about the similarities and differences with Cosmos and the app chains.
Great. Okay. So Avalanche, unlike a lot of other chains like Solana, ETH, Bitcoin, Avalanche and Cosmos and Polkadot are all these sort of multi-chain blockchains. It's not a single blockchain. So there's like a bunch of different things happening. So Cosmos has its hub, which is Atom. And that was where the initial ICO happened. And that's where a lot of security is. And that's where a lot of validators are. Okay. So that's the Atom hub. And outside of the Atom hub, there are 100 other chains. on Cosmos specifically. So, and just so we understand what that means in terms of money. So last month, in the last 30 days, there's been $2.1 billion in volume just on Cosmos that is secured by IBC. Okay. So in 30 days, 2.1 billion in volume. And in the last 7 days, there's been like 627 million in IBC volume in the last 7 days. And you could see this on Map of Zones. You just Google Map of Zones and you'll see the zones. Each of these Cosmos chains are also called zones. And you'll see them interacting like, planets in an ecosystem. So that's really big news because like IBC is that means IBC is like a transformative technology. And it also means like as you secure more and more money, it becomes a national security issue, right? It becomes a national security technology. It's not just, we're bridging, meme coins. We're bridging like sovereign assets, and it could be used for stuff that's permissioned, right? Like banks want that. So I'll wrap. I'm going to come back here. So Avalanche is very similar to Cosmos in that you can spin up millions of subnets. So the future of Avalanche as we know it will be like basically millions of subnets. Each of them can be secured by their own validator set. And the reason is because not everybody in the world has the mandate to validate public blockchains. And that's just reality. Like Bitcoin maximalists can have an argument about it, but JP Morgan is not going to validate right now. They're not going to validate blockchains. They would rather have an ETF and have it custodied by all the words. You just have all the financial words. That whole chain of events has to take place, but it can only take place if they run their own validators, if their own relayers, if they run their own infrastructure. So that can happen on an Avalanche subnet. It can also happen on a Cosmos zone. We see right now in adoption, JP Morgan, Citi, T. Rowe Price, SK Planet, a lot of mainstream institutional like banks are creating Avalanche subnets. And the reason they're doing this is because they can control in and outflow and they can control KYC. So that's the sort of general overview of Avalanche and Cosmos. They're really similar in shape and in like ideology, but they have different downstream effects because of their consensus algorithm.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really cool. If anybody's been listening to the Smart Economy podcast, especially since maybe June of 2023, a handful of our guests have kind of dropped Easter eggs that these banks and these financial institutions, they've been quietly building over the past few years, and they might not be releasing press releases or kind of shilling the work that they've been doing in the Web3 space, but they have been here. So it's really exciting to hear that maybe even you firsthand or some folks that have been helping these institutions kind of learn their way around at least subnets when it comes to Avalanche. And I'm sure that there's more out there that they're doing that we're not even familiar with. So I'm curious to hear then, would you consider Landslide to be more of an Avalanche team kind of masquerading in the Cosmos world? Or would you be more of a Cosmos team kind of wearing a Cosmos shirt in the Avalanche world? Are you kind of like a perfect meld of both, or something completely different? How would you kind of describe that?
Great question. I just wanted to give a big shout out to the Avalanche team as a whole. They've been extraordinarily helpful to us. Morgan Kropetsky is their head of institutional sales. John Wu as the head of BD has been great. And obviously Goon, Kevin, and their technical team, Stephen, Lucian, Patrick O'Grady. These guys are pushing, pushing the sort of razor's edge of where things are in terms of technical capabilities. And so yeah, like big shout out to Avalabs. We're more like of Avalanche friendly folks primarily first. So like if you imagine in your head, like, each of these Web3 ecosystems communicating with one another. We're like the bridge into and out of Avalanche for IBC specifically. So that means like as IBC sort of expands just out of Cosmos, like fish kind of coming out of the ocean and these different ecosystems communicating with each other, there's a entry point into and out of Avalanche, and we aim to be that.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious then, because earlier in our conversation, you were really extolling the virtues of IBC as a new kind of network. And one of the conversations I had in Washington, D.C. 2 weeks ago was, you've touched upon this as well, that this does become a national security issue if you ignore it. This is almost like banning crypto and blockchain networks in the US is almost like saying we don't want to be a part of SWIFT in 1970. So you're kind of talking about IBC being this new, really powerful kind of protocol. Is this on par with what the next iteration of kind of intercontinental, intergovernment kind of rails is going to be like? Is IBC the solution? Is it part of it? Where does it kind of fit into this new paradigm that blockchain networks are creating, where we're going to eradicate SWIFT and instead have something completely new, bigger, better, faster, and more accessible?
Great question, Dylan. It's a long one too. So as a whole, SWIFT is being basically sunset. People know SWIFT has also been hacked by state actors, right? So you can Google, you can take a look that I'm not going to name them, but you can Google who the state actors are that are making the attacks on SWIFT. They are people who are not included in SWIFT, so there are obviously economic incentives for them to destroy it. That being said, other big financial instruments that we've used to underpin other asset classes, like LIBOR, which is the rate at which banks can lend money to each other. These are also being reevaluated, and they're basically being sunset as well. I encourage listeners, if you don't know what LIBOR is, it's LIBOR. It's the London, like it's a rate that basically it's a multi-sig. Okay, LIBOR is like a multi-sig for like 15 banks, and they measure how they're going to basically lend money to each other. So that is sort of going on. And then meanwhile, China is issuing its own central bank digital currency. Apparently, Argentina now wants to get onto the US dollar and also Bitcoin. El Salvador is kind of in that boat. And then, when you squint back from these things, each sovereign nation wants control over its own money supply. Bitcoin in the block, in the initial Genesis block, said the reason, this was the reason that it was formed, which is chancellors on the brink of bailouts, for the second brink of bailouts in 2008. And so this is why we're even here, right? Like, so why we're even on this podcast and discussing this, stupidity is that the financial systems have failed over and over and over and over and over again. And that's because we can't verify their ledger. That's the thing. So if we have like a larger verifiable ledger that's faster and other people can participate in, that will help solve a lot of these issues. That's why Bitcoin started, right? So your question is really about national security, and banning crypto outright is a terrible idea, because it's, as you said, it's like banning us from the SWIFT protocol in 1970 before this was even a thing. It's a terrible idea. Regulation by enforcement is, no one wants this. No one who understands the tech wants this, and no one who understands the security implication wants this. So what do? Like, you have to either lobby people, like BlackRock is obviously going to push the Bitcoin ETF, and it's going to go through, and then the ETH ETF will happen, and then these assets will go into people's retirement funds, and that's the small sort of exposure into that. What you mentioned about, do we think about like Landslide, Avalanche, IBC? Do we think about these things in terms of like nation state adoption? We hope so. The issue is IBC is not a bridge. Okay, so there's no externally verified bridge, like a set of validators or like a concrete bridge from land to land. There's no bridge really. It's not technically a bridge. It doesn't function like a bridge, and there's no central point of failure. So if you're sending something over IBC, which is processed about $40-50 billion total, okay, nothing comes close. Chainlink doesn't come close. No other bridge comes close to what IBC is processed. So if you're sending something over IBC and it fails, it will revert, right? And so the failure process is a lot more secure. It functions like TCP/IP. So there's no validators who are really validating the transaction itself. People are relaying information and they're relayers, but there's not a third-party extractive value token in the middle of IBC. Okay. And that as a characteristic is more likely to onboard institutions who want to run their own relayers, but don't want to be involved with third-party tokens or third-party bridges that they have to validate or get a mandate to even hold.
Yeah. So then why build kind of these Cosmos zones in Avalanche land? Is it because having like a subnet is much more tangible to these financial institutions? Why would it be more appealing to them to kind of leverage IBC and Cosmos zones, but do it on Avalanche tech and that tech stack?
So great question. Our bet is on Avalanche Consensus and IBC like as a tech. So in our view, the crown jewel of Cosmos is not anything except for IBC. That's like number one. The fact that even works like coherently and has not lost a single dollar and processed billions of dollars, that's enough for us to be like, okay, this is worthwhile to build on. Whether or not institutions build on it, like we have to build the bridge there. And so like a big shout out to the Interchain Foundation, who's like the steward of open source software in the Cosmos ecosystem, because they funded the open source light client that connects Cosmos to Avalanche. So even if Landslide disappears or whatever, the light clients between Cosmos and Avalanche and any other IBC light client. So, a big shout out to Composable. They've built the light client for Polkadot. They're working on Solana, and they were also working on ETH. Toki and the data chain team are working on Binance. So like IBC is kind of spreading out, and it's spreading out in these tendrils called light clients. And these light clients are open source methods to verify our state changes, to verify the ledger. And these are all open source. So like what our bet is that as IBC goes up against externally verified bridges, Chainlink, Axelar, Layer 0, Wormhole, these externally verified bridges go up against TCP/IP, and in the long run, it's a race to the bottom and a bet on security. So yeah.
And what's the purpose of the light clients? Is that essentially just to communicate the state between each of the two chains?
Yep. It's also to prevent spoofing, right? So each light client has its own ID, so that way you're sure, like if you're sending something from Cosmos to Avalanche, like a token, you can be sure that the state of your wallet changes as you send it to another chain. So they have just to be clear for the nerds out there who are going to come for me, is that there are two layers on IBC. There's a transport layer, which is transporting the message. And then there's this application layer, which is transporting all the other logic. So token transfers, wallet balances, DeFi protocol. And then there are these sort of, the next stage of that is like what the intent of that packet is.
So how many folks do you have at Landslide working on? Is it safe to say it's a bridging solution, or is there's more than just that? It's a great question. Like it functions like a bridge, but it's not a bridge. So it's basically like an interoperability protocol. Got it. How many folks are on your team?
Yeah. We've got 7 people on our team.
Yeah. And do you have what's the breakdown like? Is everybody kind of a jack of all trades, or do you have like a Avalanche expert and an IBC expert? And
great question. Everyone is mostly developers right now. So I'm sort of the jack of all trades. and our other developers, like our CTO, he's been an expert in, he helped contribute to Evmos when Evmos was the artist known as Ethermint in 2018. So he's an old school Cosmos dude, but he's also very well schooled in Avalanche. And then we have a lot of our team is just building Go code. I'll share with you a bit about where we are in our tech stack. So the IBC Lite client, which was funded by a grant from the Interchain Foundation, that's completed, and now it's headed to an audit at Halborn, and that should be done basically around April 1st. That is going to be in test. So we're going to be in testnet. We're in testnet now. And because we're not doing a public sale for compliance side reasons, we have a lot more tokens to give out to people to incentivize users to bridge assets from Cosmos or Polkadot or Binance. Any chain that's connected to IBC, we're happy to give out tokens to. Our testnet's open. People can go to the website and sign up. And we're going to be in testnet for a while to encourage users to bridge assets over and interact with, like, basically we're throwing a party like between Cosmos and Avalanche and Polkadot users, and as many users as we can get, so that they all kind of meet each other and like the dexes start talking natively to each other. So Osmosis assets will be natively on the Avalanche Trader Joe dex or the Pangolin dex, or the validator protocols, like the liquid staking validator protocols like GoGoPool on Avalanche and Stride on Cosmos will start talking to each other natively. And so this is kind of like a party, and we're just we're encouraging users to throw the party, and we're giving them tokens to do that.
Yeah, you mentioned, you kind of like threw a dog whistle out there that I want to just double down on, and you brought up Ethermint. So just to, like, right now, Landslide is in testnet, and the contracts are still under audit, but Ethermint is kind of like an OG project that was trying to create like a light client that can make it easier to operate between the EVM and the Cosmos worlds. So I might have gotten it wrong. I'm not a dev. So could you just kind of like quick Eli 5 what Ethermint is, so that the folks listening to this can kind of just get a sense of the weight that is thrown around when you're an OG building on that project and now building something like this?
Sure. Well, it means that our CTO has been involved in the tech stack for a really long time, since 2018. And if people are clamoring for the trust but verify, we can provide our PRs if someone wants to figure out if we're telling the truth about that. So what that means, Evmos is basically like, in its word, it's like Ether and Cosmos. And so what it's trying to, they are an EVM. So like they've brought the Ethereum virtual machine into Cosmos. They aren't bridging assets per se. They might actually. I might be speaking out of turn. But as far as I understand, they weren't bridging assets from Ether to Cosmos, because there hasn't been an Ethereum to Cosmos light client until basically now. Like Polymer's working on it. Union is working on a ZK version, and Composable is building an Ether light client as well. So what that means is Evmos is like the Ether Cosmos connect in terms of virtual machines.
Yeah, that's cool. You mentioned that your team is building a lot of solutions in Go. Just curious to hear why you guys chose Golang. What are the opportunities and constraints that coding in that language offers?
Yeah, so Go is a coding language that Google built and is open source, and it's used all over the blockchain stack. So when people say the word Geth, Geth, that stands for Go ETH, meaning that's like the ETH packet basically that runs on Go. There's also Avalanche Go. There's a big section of the Avalanche stack is written in Go, and IBC Go. And so Go as a lower level like backend programming language is really, really fast and scalable, and it's also kind of standardized across different blockchain stacks. So the reason we opted for that is because it's used everywhere, and it's sort of the initial, it's like kind of like English. It's used everywhere on the clients.
Is it super composable, or is it in the sense that you can copy and paste, or is it just like you've seen this in another ecosystem, so you kind of have an idea how to build it and it's much easier to build from scratch?
Yeah, it's composable. Absolutely.
Cool. We, at the risk of opening a can of worms, we spoke earlier about regulations and the impact that regional regulations can have on builders and blockchain networks within a geographic jurisdiction. So I am curious to hear a little bit about Landslide's perspective on permissioned and permissionless chains. And maybe you guys might even have a set of clients that ask you to build out permissioned chains for them. So could you maybe just expound a little bit on the team's philosophy between these two chains, and maybe also share some high-level examples if you do have clients that are seeking these permission solutions from your team?
Sure. Great question. So permissioned is what got us into the problems that we're in now. And that argument is correct. Like, we don't like that, but Celsius, FTX, these type of things gets us into the permission problem. Because if it's not your keys, it's not your coins. And that just opens a big door to the insanity. On the other hand, permissionless, like Luna, Terra collapsed, that was permissionless. And it was a permissionless scam, essentially, that was hard to unravel for the average person. So on both sides, people got shanked, right? It doesn't matter if you were permissioned or permissionless, if you can spin up garbage or if you can steal people's keys. And so that, the landscape is that those pieces of reality are hard to swallow. On the other hand, from a regulatory perspective, you have to have permissioned nodes. You have to have, you're just not going to run a business on that. Like, you can't. So if you exist in the US and you have a financial mandate, like they have a gun to your head saying you have to do this. If you don't do this, we're going to fine you and put you in jail. It's a real simple game there. So whatever the government is telling the institutions, you have to run a purple node. You have, then if they're telling you that, you have to run a purple node. It doesn't matter what ethics you have about it, what your personal opinion is. You have to do that. So the people that will win that battle are those who can provide the infrastructure to do that. We think that's IBC. We think that's Avalanche. That's sort of our thesis about it. The people who have the institutional clients are really on the BD side of Ava Labs. They are the ones who are doing Fidelity, T. Rowe Price, Citibank, JP Morgan, and then all the host of video games on the top of that, right? Like SK Planet, Shrapnel. There's a massive list of them. I know I'm missing a big one. There's a big Ukrainian studio, a game studio, Off the Grid. Thank you. That's coming out. That's like obviously a brilliant game, but the games don't want to get their traffic and their users mixed up with permissionless chains. It's naive to think that over time it just won't work. So the big clients, I'd say Ava Labs is doing a great job of closing. If you look on the Cosmos side, DYDX is a massive client that has open sourced all their work. To give you an idea, in the last 7 days, DYDX processed $33 million. You can see that on Map of Zones. Noble, the Noble team is building a great partnership with Circle and USDC. And in the last 7 days, Noble's processed $64 million. So, and then there are other groups inside of Cosmos, Millicent. Millicent.io. They're one that's building with a host of institutional clients, and you can see them on their website. So the way that we help out institutional clients is in some sense, we can just build the lower level TCP/IP protocol for them to build on. And then when people start using it, we'll benefit from that.
So at the beginning of the conversation, I asked you how the resiliency in DeFi can be improved by these interoperability protocols connecting different ecosystems. But now, after what I just heard you say, I'm wondering, is TradFi and are these new games that are leveraging digital assets, are these ecosystems actually going to become strengthened and emboldened by interoperability protocols?
Yep. That's a great question, Dylan. So I spoke to it depends on the game and it depends on the company. So if you're a company like, I know Off the Grid, they want to keep their their NFTs on their own chain, and they want to control the validators. That said, they would be open to ideas getting new users if those NFTs were transferable into Stargaze on Cosmos or some of the other NFT projects via IBC. They're open to that. They just want to, at the same time, maintain their control of their validators because they're a corporation. That said, there's an IBC function called a solo machine, which is like perfect for central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, to launch. And also, if you can control basically everything there, it's like a solo machine. But without the connections to other IBC channels like Avalanche or Cosmos, it becomes less useful. So, the question is, how do these assets interact over time? They're going to interact over time if there's the channel there and the legal mandate. So, these institutions are just like older versions of us, like more conservative versions of us who have a different mandate than us, but they all see the writing on the wall, right? Like the game is like, there's no other casino in town, right? You can't go and get blood from a stone in the stock market. If you want to get crazy returns, there's a certain section of the market you can do that, and that's called crypto. Like you can get your face ripped off, or you can verify and be very conservative and do very little. Like Bitcoiners are great at this. Long-term Bitcoin holders are just great at that. They view everything else as a risk, and they just do this one thing. So, what does DeFi look like long-term? You're going to have both permissioned and permissionless, and you just need the pipes to build that. We hope that's IBC, and we hope that's Avalanche.
You mentioned that you're working with financial institutions, and I'm sure that the conversations around the water coolers.
So we're not directly. Honestly, we don't have them in our Rolodex. Ava Labs business development does, and if you want to take a look, shout out to Morgan Kropetsky, John Wu, and the entire BD team at Ava Labs. They do a massive job about reaching out to institutions. The ICF, Interchain Foundation at Cosmos, also does a really good job of reaching out to institutions. We've been working on building a consortium of IBC enabled chains. And so that consortium could be of help to institutions, like providing education, a lot like R3 Corda did their reach out. So we're putting together that as well. Everyone's kind of like, where is IB? Like, what is IBC doing? And so there's obviously some education and reach out to do. But the rubbing elbows isn't really native to Landslide.
Perfect. Then I guess I'll just pivot a little bit. You and your team are part of the Interchain Builders program. So can you just expand a little bit on what that is? Is it just like a aggregation of builders in IBC land, or is it more of kind of a top-down focused sort of strategy from the Interchain Foundation?
Great question, man. There are. This is a great interview, man. You've really done your homework, and I appreciate your diligence on this. So the Interchain Builders program, we were selected as a Q3 participant. You can Google the Interchain Builders program. It's free to enter. You basically apply, and you get added to a group of similar builders who are building in the Interchain. Interchain has mostly been focused on Cosmos, but that's expanding, obviously, as IBC goes out. So it's been a community from the ICF and also other Web3 business owners who can share diligence reports on investors or deal flow in terms of your fundraise. The team there, shout out to Gnome and Steph Sprins at the ICF. They've done an enormous helping startups like with their go-to-market strategy, with feedback on their tech, with feedback on networking. A lot of the stuff in Cosmos is really and Web3 is really who and getting a community of people that you can trust. Trust but verify is also really valuable. So the Builders program has basically been like a small version of a a cohort. They help you with some of the basics.
Yeah, that's really cool. Something else that I was kind of curious to hear a little bit more in what you were saying in your previous response to my question is are there any kind of like ways that you and your team have contributed to either IBC land or Avalanche land using lessons that you learned about building this quote unquote bridge between the two? Maybe like you found a defunct piece of code that because you were trying to connect IBC to a subnet, that this is now something that you and your team were able to raise the flag of awareness on and state, hey, this is a new issue that we found because we're doing this unique type of bridging two ecosystems. Have there been any examples of kind of like things you've learned about the other chain because you've been connecting another chain to it?
Great question, dude. Yeah, you got some good questions. I usually don't say that, but you have some good questions. So we didn't find any. There were no like bugs, undisclosed bugs that we didn't report, and there was never a up the chain of command for that. Never happened. Usually, like we've been working on this on the Light client basically all year. So, and here's where I get to shout out to the Strangelove team. Strangelove is one of the sort of stewards of the Cosmos space, and they've been helping us all year. Shout out to Jack Zampolin and Andrew and Alex on their team there. They've been enormously helpful to us from the Cosmos side and explaining how IBC Go and how the relayers function. So we've had weekly stand-ups with them, and from the Ava Labs side, their team, Lucian and Stephen in particular, and Patrick O'Grady have been enormously helpful communicating between those two languages. That said, the interesting thing, we didn't find a bug, but we've solved sort of an intractable issue, which other teams have tried to solve, which was how do you make Tendermint communicate to Avalanche Consensus? Because they're two different consensus algorithms, and we've solved how to do that within the IBC Lite client. And we can get into a Tendermint discussion, and I can clearly sort of explain the Avalanche Consensus and to listeners, if you'd like.
Oh, I mean, I'm a big fan of Tendermint. The ecosystem I've been in day in and day out uses a BFT as well for its consensus mechanism. So maybe you can share just maybe high level a few key takeaways of Avalanche's, I guess, delegated proof of stake consensus mechanism, and then also how that communicates with Tendermint BFT.
Great. Okay. So, Avalanche doesn't use DPoS, delegated proof of stake. It's not per se as the term. So sort of stepping back, when we think about consensus, Tendermint, I should say, when you think about consensus, you're like in a stadium and you're trying to like establish like blue or red, and you're trying to poll people in the stadium blue or red. And in Tendermint, all of the people in the stadium have to talk to each other. Everybody in the stadium has to literally talk to every other single person in the stadium to determine blue or red. And that's why in the Cosmos white paper, you can look at it and you could see that the Atom validators are capped at 300, hard cap 300 in the Cosmos white paper. That's a downstream effect of the Tendermint consensus algorithm, the method that they use to determine red or blue. In Avalanche, it's different. Not every person has to talk to every other person. A single person asks like 5 people, for example, red or blue. And then those 5 people ask another 5 people, and those 5 people ask another 5 people. So you're still polling the stadium. You personally don't have to ask 1,000 people red or blue. So you're still achieving consensus around the decision. You just don't have to you don't run into this problem. Now, the problem in colloquially in the industry is called the N squared problem. And this is, and as validators, as you get more and more validators, basically people participating in the network, that problem becomes, it's a quadratic problem. It becomes a larger problem faster. So Avalanche doesn't have this. It's a subsampling. So you sample a small section of the stadium and say, hey man, red or blue. So yeah, that's how that works. And then in terms of how that works in the Light client itself, it's I would say a simple explanation is waiting for the header on the block to be relayed on Cosmos to be relayed into Avalanche, and waiting for that and to confirm on the light client side. That's the simple explanation.
So we're kind of getting near the end of our conversation. I kind of want to.
Sure, we can extend.
We
can extend, man. I'm happy to,
I know you are. We could also probably do multiple of these episodes.
Sure. Yeah.
And it would be a great time. But I'm just kind of curious to hear, let's say 6 months from now, Landslide is now live on both main nets. How will I, as a retail user, what are some use cases that I can expect to interact with Landslide?
Great question. Our success will be if people don't know they're using Landslide. That's the biggest success. It's not another interface. Like, our ideal scenario is that someone wants to send Osmo tokens on Osmosis to Osmo on Trader Joe in a single swap. And Landslide tokens are just abstracted from that, so that when that transaction happens, they send tokens from Osmosis and they show an intent in the transaction, which is, a UX that's going to be on Osmosis. I want to swap this on Osmosis on Avalanche. That whole chain of events just happens, and they don't think about me. They don't think about Landslide. They just think about the swap. So yeah, there's some steps we have to take to get there, but the end stage is that we don't want to build a competitor to the DEXs. We don't want to build app competitors. We just want to, we want to build these pipe systems so that the pipes work and that these existing apps can start communicating.
Yeah, and you mentioned a few times a potential Landslide token that folks can go out and earn and be rewarded for participating in testnet. To me, it sounds like the Landslide token will be used to kind of maybe vote for validators on either network, and also maybe even be used to migrate between IBC and Avalanche subnet land. Maybe I'm incorrect or misunderstanding. Can you just share a little bit more about what the use cases and the uses for the Landslide token will be?
Sure. Okay. So great question. Again, well done, sir. Okay. So when you transfer tokens between IBC zones, you don't assume that the bridge, anything about the bridge. IBC is just, there's no assumption you make. You're just trusting that IBC functions. However, you are trusting that the target and the source chain are valid. So if Osmosis somehow gets malicious and gets attacked, or Landslide gets attacked, so you have to use the Landslide tokens, to keep the target or the source chain on the Avalanche side safe. So the ideal scenario is that Landslide becomes permissionless, so that anybody can validate it. It should not be, you don't need to KYC. That's not involved at all. And Avalanche is also spinning up a sort of pay-as-you-go validator and subnet only validators. So what this means for Cosmos validators, or Polkadot validators, or Bitcoin validators, is that these economic security guarantees can be transferred between subnets and transferred between chains. Sorry, I know. I think my audio just went out there. Just to reiterate that, each blockchain has its own validator set, and it's keeping the chain secure. We see this in Cosmos sort of evolving into providing security for other chains. So it's like, if your house is secure, you can provide your security system to another house. And this is called sort of mesh security, and mesh security is kind of expanding. You can see this in the Babylon chain. Big shout out to their team. They're providing Bitcoin staking security basically to Cosmos. So that means they're allowing Bitcoin stakers in a permissionless contract to earn fees on other networks. So
very cool. So is it safe to say that Landslide will be kind of its own security provider then for all the chains that it interacts with? Yeah.
So the Landslide validators will provide economic security to Landslide, and then the next step is Cosmos validators will provide security to Landslide. Bitcoin people through Babylon will provide security to Landslide. So that's how that will work. So Landslide tokens keep Landslide safe alongside, obviously the consensus and uptime of the validators. There is no slashing, as you can see in Cosmos. There's slashing for validators. You don't need to do that. We're opted not to do that. It's a whole other rabbit hole, but there's no slashing that takes place. It's just you just don't collect the rewards. So yeah, the short answer to your question is yes. We're offering users tokens for performing exercises like bridge Noble to Avalanche and back, bridge Osmo from Avalanche to back, like spin up a permissionless chainlet on Saga and bridge that on Avalanche, build a generalized abstraction layer on Burnt and bridge that to Avalanche, bridge tokens from Composable, like bridge Polkadot tokens from Kusama from Composable into Avalanche and back. So this is just like getting people into the Monopoly game of how the players and the moves work.
Awesome. And you guys mentioned that your contracts are under audit right now, due to be back in April. So I'm assuming maybe when mainnet is probably sometime middle of next year.
Yep.
If I'm right, let me know. If not, what else is on the roadmap?
Yeah, great question. So Halborn is auditing our IBC Lite client. Oak is auditing Oak Security. Shout out to them. They're a big Cosmos focused security firm. They're auditing our Cosmos client, our Cosmos VM, our CosmWasm VM. We also have an EVM. And so all of these pieces are being audited, but as long as they're in testnet, they're considered safe. And that's the other piece of paying people in the tokens is that they're going to be able to perform some feedback for us on those packages. So yeah, mainnet is like probably April, May, somewhere around there. If the bull run keeps running, and more IBC chains keep turning on onto mainnet, we'll extend the incentivized testnet to a little further.
Cool. And if someone is listening to this and they're interested in testing out Landslide, where should we send the listeners?
Yeah, landslide.network.
Awesome. Nathan, this was a super fun conversation. I've been playing around in the Cosmos ecosystem for a handful of years now, and it was really cool to hear the lessons learned that your team is bringing from building in both IBC and Avalanche land. And also really cool to hear just the Cornell ties and how you ended up in both of these ecosystems. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come join us on the Smart Economy podcast today. It was a fascinating conversation.
Dylan, I appreciate your time and your diligence and preparation, sir. Well done.
I appreciate it. Well, hopefully there's still enough time today for you to do a little surfing.
Oh, yeah.
Cheers, brother. Well, what did you think of that conversation? I thought it was fascinating to hear about the connection to Cornell that both the founders in Avalanche and Cosmos have, and that Nathan seemed like he was poised to be in the right place at the right time. It was also really interesting to learn more about the strengths that an Avalanche Cosmos bridged landscape can yield. And I really enjoyed learning about the differences and similarities between the two consensus mechanisms for both networks. Head over to landslide.network to begin testing out the testnet now. To keep up to date with the Smart Economy podcast, head over to smarteconomypodcast.com. And please don't hesitate to rate and review any of these episodes if you've enjoyed listening to them. The more folks that rate and review, the more we get to be put into other people's ears and eyes. And of course, if you're a NEO token holder, please consider voting for NEO News Today as your NEO Council representative. We've proudly been serving the NEO ecosystem since 2017, and we'll continue to do so by putting portions of our council income directly back into ecosystem growth initiatives. With all that said, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the Smart Economy podcast, and we look forward to catching you next time.